do we have to the risks or prevent the risks, and how can we save ourselves from any negative scenarios? Look, I'm sure that Ukraine is ready. Ukraine, first of all, as for the forecasts, for instance, as for the 37 billion, and the next year the sum will be lower. According to the forecasts of the National Bank, that will be $25 billion, and in 2026 it will be even lower. So that is why this is the basic scenario. When the National Bank is providing its forecasts, it's saying about the risks with minus. For instance, the negative risks are the security risks, the war. The sooner the war is over, the better it is, and vice versa. The longer it is, the worse it is. For instance, the negative risk is the rhythmical manner and the frequency of international financial assistance, and the positive risks are funding for the recovery of our state. And the more funding like that we get, the better everybody feels. The Ukrainian banking system, Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian business, the Ukrainian state. So we know that now, from different sources, we know that there are different active discussions about the frozen assets of Russian Federation are going on. I really expect for the positive solution of these issues, in particular when we speak about the income from the, for instance, frozen assets. For instance, as far as I understand, it is being debated. And there are certain decisions about that. This is just the first step, but it is incredibly important for our state to have access to those $300 billion of frozen assets of Russian Federation. The aggressor country has also to have financial responsibility for the destroyed objects and ruining which they inflict during almost 2 years of the war. I need to say that macro-financial assistance, which we are getting either as loans or as any other type of assistance, it is incredibly important for our state. And macro stability, which we had last year, and the increase of GDP and the currency market stability, low inflation rate, there were lots of factors why exactly we had such indicators. But altogether, one of the key factors was external international financial assistance. Because, for instance, if we speak about the banking market, and it's, well, we may say that it's fully based on the macro component. The macro situation of 2023 was favorable for the banks, and we may say that the financial sector was altogether working in the favorable macroeconomic conditions. The increase of GDP, if you remember, in the beginning of 23, we were waiting for 2%, but then we had 5.7%, or inflation rate. In the beginning of 2023, we were expecting 27%, but in fact, the inflation rate as of the beginning of the current year is approximately 5%. The incredible increase of the golden reserves of the National Bank of Ukraine is an incredibly positive factor both for the Ukrainian hryvnia and the banking system, as it is $40.5 billion as of today. So we may say that, again, knowing how the banking system is based upon the macro of 2024, the National Bank recently has updated its macroeconomic forecast, and in spite of some of the indicators which are being changing dynamically, they are still interesting. We have the increase of GDP, or as for inflation rate, it's not 5%, it will be high, but according to the forecast of the National Bank, it will be a bit higher than 8% as of the end of the year. It is moderate and under control. The international reserve of the National Bank will be more than $40 billion. This is also an important indicator for our financial system, for the stability of the currency market. It is positive. So I may say that such a conclusion, according to the basic scenario, as this is the basic scenario of the National Bank, as of today, the financial sector in 2024 will be developing as well in the favorable macroeconomic conditions. Well, I can name you several figures about the banking system if you are interested, just for us to understand under which conditions, which indicators we have. First, on the one hand, the banking system is continuously working 24/7 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We did not stop it for a single day or an hour. We are preserving the money of the private entities, and it is reflected in the trust of legal entities and private persons to the banking system. As for allocation of money, the funding base of the banks is stable. The amount of money of the clients has increased for more than 778 billion hryvnia, both legal entities and private persons, in all of the currencies during this almost 2 years of the war, 2022 till 2024. And the hryvnia investments of the population since the beginning of the combats have increased for 64.6%. People are increasing banking system more. The crediting is slowly but recovering. The pure credits and loans still there have increased for 22%. The increase has taken place thanks to the recovery of the card loans, and also we had the increase of mortgage loans thanks to the program Ye Osela. The hryvnia loans during 2023 have decreased a bit for 1.5%. But if we look at June-December of last year, we could see the tendency for the increase of crediting of corporate business. Banks altogether are optimistic about the increase of crediting. They are recovering, they are embedding the increase of crediting into their business portfolio. We had the assessment of 10% in average all over the banking system. There are banks which have lower or higher indicators, who have different strategies. In the surveys about the conditions of crediting, banks are mentioning the increase of credit demand, especially from SMEs, and they're expecting for that further on. In 2023, this is the first time since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the banks are also saying about the need of capital investments of the enterprises. This is an important factor. So those trends, if we are speaking about crediting now, in 2023, they will be preserved for 2024. And also we need to say that the National Bank, together with the partners, is developing the strategy of the recovery of crediting. This is our priority, as the National Bank states. And this strategy, obviously, will become a weightful driver for our recovery, taking into account that the share of the state at the banking market is rather substantial as of today. As for the banking system, if there are any questions, I can answer, but that's it so far. Thank you. Let us also speak about the foreign currency. In particular, yesterday we heard the new Big Mac index. According to it, the Ukrainian currency rate is underestimated for 48%. Can you agree with that? Look, before the Great War, I heard for multiple times the certain assessments, the indices and so on. So, can I agree with that or not? The international companies all over the world are holding certain analysis. For me, it is incredibly important, if we are speaking about the currency market state, the situation which we have at the currency market. If it is not stable, let us just assume. Do you remember the beginning of the war in 2014 or 15 and what happened with the banking system? And we remember, in fact, the Great War of 2022, the beginning of 2022 and 2023, how now the banking system is keeping defense, how the currency market is relatively stable. So I may tell you that for the National Bank, the currency market and the rate stability, the financial stability is a priority. It is doing everything possible for that. So we have certain outcomes for that. For instance, if we look at the dynamics of the currency rate in November, Or let us even assume the October of last year, and as of today, we can see that the National Bank on the one hand is changing the currency rate policy and goes to the flexible currency rate policy. The National Bank says that the hryvnia will be deviating, maybe the rate will be a bit fluctuating, and in fact it is happening, it is taking place. When we first went to this policy, hryvnia has solidified. During the first days of January, it has become lower. We were speaking about the situational ad hoc reasons why we saw these tendencies, and now we can see that hryvnia is stable, the situation is stable. There can be deviation, and sometimes it can become even stronger. We also said that we will expand those limits and of deviation, and we said that this is the seasonal factor which impacts the rate of Ukrainian hryvnia. That was the same before the Great War. During some periods, the hryvnia became stronger or weaker. And we can also see, looking at the example of the last Sunday, if we look at the market, the export and import have balanced. And during the period of the Great War, the National Bank had more interventions. The National Bank always has interventions, but for other corporations, if we speak about last week, because there were more than $400 million allocated from the foreign exchange reserve of the National Bank of Ukraine. And also we can see that the spread of cash and cashless rates has decreased substantially. If in the first half of October it was 5%, then now it is at the indicator of 2, maybe a bit more percent. And since the middle of January, we can see the tendency that the demand for the foreign currency is decreasing, and hryvnia is stabilizing and strengthening. National Bank will necessarily follow the strategy. So the currency stability will be one of our priorities, and we'll do everything possible for the situation at the currency market to be stable, under control, and foreseeable. What are your expectations about the inflation rate and the ability to pay among the citizens of this year, and which factors will they depend on? Look, as of inflation rate, according to the forecasts of the National Bank, the situation is 5%. According to the forecasts, since the beginning of the second half of the year, it will be increasing, and as of the end of the year, it will be a bit more than 8%. But this is the forecast of the National Bank as of now. The forecasts may be changing, mostly 4 times during the year, and they can surprise us in a nice way. If we speak about inflation rate last year, as of the beginning of the last year, it was 27%, but in fact, it's only 5%. So this substantial decrease of inflation rate is a very nice example for our Ukrainian banking system and for the National Bank, because inflation, when we look at the National Bank, we have our own priorities. This is the price stability. So inflation rate should be within the target range which we adopt. It is plus 5% plus or minus 1%, and also helping the economic growth. So the control over inflation by the National Bank is incredibly important, because as of the inflation, as one of the bankers of the US said, you cannot flirt with inflation, because once it can in fact impact you. Looking at the example of Turkey, yeah, and I really respect it because it's one of the top 20 economies of the world, they never controlled inflation. They never controlled this process. And as of today, their inflation is more than 60%. And even last week, their National Bank has increased the interest rate to 45%. And let me remind, Turkey is not at war. It's a huge economy. But, in fact, their discount rate is 45, in Ukraine 15, and inflation 65, in Ukraine 5. So our control over inflation is incredibly important. And I think that the forecast of the National Bank and its probability is very high. As for the pricing, There are lots of discussions now, and I'm taking part in them as well, because lots of citizens say the inflation rate is not 5%, because look at the prices in the stores. I would like to tell you that when the State Service of Statistical Data takes into account the inflation rate, they take 335 groups of goods and services. So when I'm speaking about 5%, that's inflation which we had in December last year in comparison with December 2022. This is the average annual one. Very often, in winter the prices are higher, but in summer they're lower, and so on. This is the cyclical deviation depending on different tendencies. The price can be changing for sugar or eggs. So for us it is important to have the statistics, the State Statistical Service, which provides certain calculations. So looking at the last year, for instance, as for the meat products, the prices have increased to 20%, and as for eggs, they decreased for 9.5%, or sunflower oil, they decreased for 14.9%. And again, 335 groups of goods. So during the year, you don't use all of the groups of goods. You did not buy a refrigerator, maybe, because you use it for 10 years at least. You did not buy anything concrete, maybe, but other groups of goods may have the increased prices. But psychologically, we are paying more attention to the goods whose prices are increasing. And if they're lower, we don't pay attention to that. The inflation this year, according to the forecast of the National Bank of Ukraine, maybe will be even better. There are lots of risks, and risks of forecasting, and as I already mentioned, are there as well. The security factors, the rhythmical and the amount of international financial assistance, and positive risks. Those are money for the recovery of our state, which will positively impact our economy. As for the increase of salaries, yes, the average monthly salary or annual salary will be definitely increasing. In 2023 it has increased as well, and in 2024 it will. The minimum salary will be increasing as well. So those factors are also impacting the indicators, including inflation rate. When we were speaking about the increase of the inflation rate, the National Bank said that one of the factors for the increase that the enterprises will consider as expenses, the increase of the expenses for energy or the increase of salaries for their employees. Yes, there is such a tendency, but it will be reflected on the pricing. Thank you, Vasyl. I'll give an opportunity for the journalists to pose the questions. If there are any questions, please. Hello, I'm Tatiana Chilyak, Ukrinform. You've already mentioned that as of now, Ukraine is holding talks with international partners about the bringing back the confiscated assets by Russia. Could you please tell whether this year we could expect for a certain transfer of at least part of these assets to Ukraine, or it's more a lengthy perspective? Thank you. You posed a very hard question. I think that, honestly speaking, no one knows about time periods. We can definitely say this is the very long story. And secondly, about 300 or 300 billion of frozen assets. This is the long-term period. But speaking about profits or income from the frozen assets, that they should be sent to a certain account and then to Ukraine, yes, the negotiations are going on. And honestly speaking, almost daily during the last week, this week, I'm getting really positive news. This is the huge advantage for us, as our partners are helping about that. I really like the proactive position of the United States of America about that, which are pushing our allies in this sphere as well. It is not that easy to solve. But again, as for the main part of the assets, it is hard. As for the income, yes, there are certain advantages and movements. Whether we have an opportunity to get income from the frozen assets this year, the assets of the Central Bank of Russian Federation, well, I think that no one will give you the specific forecasts, but we can definitely say that maybe this will be the first step, and the second step, then we will get the frozen assets themselves. And maybe it will be a very lengthy process, but the aggressor has also to have financial responsibility as well for the crimes committed in our state. Thank you, Vasyl, for your exhaustive answers. I will remind you that we were speaking about the banking system stability and the ability of pay of the citizens. At 12:30, the Media Center Ukraine Forum will come back here, and we'll be speaking about the increase of electrical energy tariffs in Ukraine. Stay with us.